Welcome back to Marketing Tip Tea Time. I'm your host, Aaron Zimala, and today we have a very special guest. And I know I say that every time, but let me tell you, all of our guests are always freaking awesome, and they are always very special. Apologies for my voice. I'm sure you can hear it a little bit. I am recovering from a little bit of a sore throat, so, sucking down lots of cough drops, and the tea definitely helps, and it's great that we have tea on the show. Our guest for this episode, which is the third guest of season 5, we're going to introduce you to Tom Rasch. Tom Rasch is an accomplished Marvel Comics artist, concept artist for video game and film projects, and a content creator. He has penciled for Marvel titles such as Punisher, 2099 as a concept artist in the video game industry. He redesigned the famed Hardy Boys for the Nancy Drew games and has worked on titles for the Sony PlayStation Network. That's a lot, isn't it? Tom also is currently building his brand and library of comic book character intellectual properties. The first of these, called Black Alpha, was published in USA Today. He also has merchandise featured on the CBS hit show The Big Bang Theory, which I watched, so that's pretty awesome, and was previously optioned for film and TV development. Tom's other characters, Salem Tusk and the Bondsman, are both in development as movie projects. Drum roll. I gotta be very light. Here's Tom Rasch. Here we go. There he is.
Well, Aaron, I couldn't have said that any better myself, and the drum roll especially. That really kind of was the capper, the creme de la
I know.
creme there, so I appreciate
Oh,
that. Yeah,
thank you. Well,
yeah.
thank you for being on the show, and where are you right now in the world?
I'm currently in Rapid City, South Dakota, which is where I grew up most of my
Nice.
childhood years. I came back to this area several years ago. Up until that point, I was living in Denver, Colorado, a couple of different times, San Francisco, Austin, Texas, and that was
Woo! Denver.
moving around, generally working in the entertainment business, especially in video games. So.
That's amazing. Well, before we dive into all of your knowledge and everything you've done, first we're going to have the most important part of the show, which is the tea. We had Rishi ship 4 seasons. There it is, 4 seasons spring
Oh,
oolong
going the
tea.
wrong way.
There we go. And when it first came, honestly, I thought, oh my gosh, I didn't know what I was doing, because there's a smaller package in this package, and it felt almost like a block of cheese
Hmm.
when it came. And I thought, oh, uh-oh, did I do the wrong thing? Turns out not. It was just packaged very well. And so I'm going to go ahead and put some of this, brew it, some of it right here on the show, as we always do. And this is, again, 4 Seasons. So 4 Seasons Spring is a tightly rolled, ball-shaped oolong tea that is harvested twice each year in central Taiwan. Named after the CG Chun 4 Seasons Spring cultivar, this oolong is grown at elevations of 500 to 850 meters in Mingjian Village, part of the famous tea-growing region of Nantou Country. Lightly oxidized, this oolong has a golden green medium-bodied infusion with a very floral, long-lasting aromatic complexity, evocative of fresh gardenia, freesia blossoms, and tropical fruit. Wow,
That was a mouthful. That was a mouthful.
that's quite the description. Here we go. As always, everybody's always interested to see if I'm going to spill tea all over my iPad, which, whoa, I filled the tea kettle a little bit too much this time, but
I do enjoy the tea cam, by the way. I didn't even know there was such a thing.
oh yeah, we figured out how to do that. Thank you to Phil Van Drunen, one of our producers, who figures all of this out. And oh, maybe I need to put a little bit more in there. It like unfurled very quickly. Huh. Okay. Everyone, this is thank you to Rishi Tea, who is one of our main tea suppliers for all of our guests. They have fantastic tea. You should all go check them out. Some of the best tea that we've ever had. And this one is truly sort of a surprise tea to me. I've never experimented with this kind of oolong before, so this could be interesting. Hopefully I'm doing it right. So while that
Well,
steeps, which is always what we do. Oh, go ahead. Yep.
I was just going to say, well, since I know this is generally kind of a marketing motif on your program here, I will say what I said before we went live, which is I'm very impressed with their packaging. The
Oh,
packaging, the actual packaging for the tea itself.
yep.
What the smaller packages come in is a beautiful design, graphic design wise, and like I said, they have a
Oh yeah.
very, very, very professional, polished presentation for how they send it to you. You feel like you're getting something special, and you're excited to
Yep.
open it up. So
It's pretty great. Actually, when we had Kolya Doms in Germany on the show, he said this was like the Apple packaging of teas. It came
I
so
would have to agree
beautifully
with that.
done. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's pretty awesome. Well, while this steeps, which not sure how long that's going to take, we're going to dive into our questions with Tom here. So the first
Okay.
little bit here, Tom, is just me doing rapid fire questions, this or that. You don't have to give any explanation. It's just sort of like first thing that comes to mind, first thing that comes to mind. Um,
Okay.
so here we go. Character design by hand or by software?
Both. Of course, it started out many years by hand. And by the way, there's a bit of a misunderstanding that when you do software, although there's a bit of this AI thing that's been going on recently, I've created art for about 15, 16 years digitally, but you still actually have to have the drawing skill. So I tell people it's a digital tool, meaning your stylus, and I work on something called a Cintiq, which is a big flat screen monitor, but you're still
Mm,
literally drawing and painting on the surface. So it is by hand through digital means, I guess is probably the easiest way that I can put it.
okay, okay, that makes sense. Salem Tusk or Black Alpha?
Oh, do I have to choose between the two
Well,
characters?
I mean, yeah, whichever one. Or if you like them both, you could also say both.
Um, well, I like them both, and I'm a new dad. My daughter's 4. Before my daughter came into my life, I had
Congratulations.
no
Yep.
children. Thank you. So my characters were kind of like my kids, and I would always tell people, and there's several that I have out in the public eye over the last almost a decade. I have probably over 20, some that I'm still kind of like later
Wow.
developing, but I would say it's like your children. You can't really pick just one that you prefer over the
Right.
other. So,
Okay.
um,
Yeah,
but I didn't know
that
if you
makes
also
sense.
wanted to know about those characters. I apologize. So I didn't know if that's what you meant with the question.
We'll dive into that in just a second. Yeah, we'll see
Okay.
which what that's like to create those characters. Next question is favorite comic book.
For me, it would probably have to be the first comic that I ever collected on my own. My mom would buy me an occasional comic book when I was in early grade school, but my life was changed when I started collecting the Uncanny X-Men. I was probably late grade school, early middle school, and I would get on my bicycle every day and go to the local supermarket once a month and buy that book. And that was the one that really got me hooked into the world of comics. So that's probably because of the it being the beginning of my path. It's my favorite comic.
Wow, wow, that's awesome. All right, so now we're gonna dive into what we were just talking about, which is like Salem Tusk or Black Alpha. How did you get into and anybody out there who doesn't know what IP is, because some people don't know what IP is,
Mhm.
it's intellectual property. So that is anything that you create, you write. Music can be intellectual property, a book, drawings, art, characters. Any movie franchises, that's all IP, intellectual property. And so when we say IP, that's what we're referring to in case somebody doesn't know that. How did you get into IP and character creation? What was that journey like?
Well, to me, they were all kind of in tandem. I started drawing after being inspired by my mother around 4 or 5, my mom Maggie, and then I started doodling a lot. And of course, like a lot of kids, you start being exposed to either TV shows or something. So I started drawing Spider-Man, Batman, the Enterprise from Star Trek, and then around 5th grade, I started having fun trying to doodle my own characters. And Black Alpha was the first one, and so he was kind of born of the notion, I suppose, of like I tell people since I saw Batman and Spider-Man and Star Trek all at the same time, I decided I wanted to do a space superhero. And so the name and kind of some of the aspects were what was created. It's evolved quite a bit over through the years, but and as a creator myself, I always tell people because I've grown up loving all these things of pop culture that are the pillars of pop culture entertainment. Star Wars, all the Marvel and DC superheroes, and
Right.
I'm very much inspired to create what I grew up with and what I loved. And so, Black Alpha is kind of my ode to like, I pitch it because it was when it was published in USA Today, I described it as, what if you took the Batman story, you sprinkled in some Iron Man tech and dropped it off in the middle of Star Wars? So
Yeah.
that's one thing. But then of course, a few years later, by the time I got in middle school and high school, Raiders of the Lost Ark had come out. And I
Yep.
had wanted to sort of create my own sort of old pulpy style hero. And originally, the story for Salem Tusk was set in the 1930s, but I borrowed a lot of the Indiana Jones formula, which is a hero who faces kind of these nefarious threats, and there's usually some sort of a supernatural aspect, like in the first Raiders film, it's the Ark of the Covenant,
Right.
and of course, I only semi-jokingly say that my first two major characters were based on Star Wars and Indiana Jones, and one came after the other, so I suppose there might be a bit of subconscious influence, but yeah, since that time, I just it's almost like in a weird sort of way too. The older I got, my brain is always on fire. It's synaptically firing constantly, and
Right.
it's I love to read. I love to self educate, and also these stories will just pop in my head by the most strange means, and then the characters come to life, and it's almost like they develop their own personalities, and the world starts to develop. And I've got so many of them in there that it gets a little crowded. But
Right.
it's almost like it's once that notion of and a passion for storytelling were probably born also at the same time me being 11 is because I tell people when I was a kid I wanted to be a rock star. I wanted to be a starship captain. Um,
Yep.
I wanted to be a filmmaker, and I wanted to draw comic books, and most of those I've made come through. I was in a band with my family, and when I drew for Marvel, actually, we were on the road in a band, so that was kind of a weird dichotomous lifestyle. But everything
Whoa.
that I currently do is, kind of like it goes back to that notion where I realize my calling as a person and as a creative spirit is the passion and I guess the world of storytelling. And I'm a big proponent of it because I could break it down into this entire diatribe of philosophical, I guess, directions. But for me,
Right.
the communications of ideas is the most powerful thing that always pretty much elevates culture and pushes it forward. So I don't care if it's somebody writing a great book, people who possibly read the Bible, if you're into
Right.
spirituality, comic books, anything that's a transfer of ideas to me is really great for humanity and for our culture. And so I guess I found my calling that comics and films and TV shows are that form for me, that it's almost like I've got to get these stories out of my system. And so, I've spent the last, especially
Right.
10 years, dealing with Hollywood and my characters and trying to get them off the ground as TV shows and films and stuff. But,
Yeah.
which by the way, for the people not in the know, it's not an easy thing to do. Not for the faint of
Right.
heart, but I still continue to stay at it because I can't imagine doing anything else, so.
Right. Well, tell me a bit about your story. You sort of touched on it real quick. I'm really interested in when you were touring in a band with your family and
Mhm.
doing things for Marvel. What was that like?
A conflicting of worlds crashing into each other because a lot of comic fans tend to be, and I'm very a self-proclaimed super nerd. I mean, I wear that on my sleeve the older that I get, but then there was a lot of shyness going on when I was a kid. But being in a band, and it was with my family, so that made it a little safer. On a side note, by the way, the family band that I was in was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame 5 years ago in South Dakota, so that was quite an honor.
What?
Yeah,
Are you
and
serious? What's the name of the
yeah,
band? What we didn't I didn't
it
even
was well. It started out well. It was Family Fair, which was with our dad Bob, and then the kids went off. Started by my sister Mary, formed her own band Dustin Rocks, and a lot of the kids migrated over to that version of the band. So they honored both Family Fair and Dustin Rocks, and that was quite an honor. But like I said, during that time, I pretty much we played gig in a club 6 nights a week. Then I come back to our room and basically work on comics until about 12 or 1 in the afternoon and sleep. So I drew the pages while I was on the road, and I would FedEx them off to Marvel. And of course, at times, and I
Wha-
will say this, as appropriate as I can. When you're in a band, you tend to get invited to a lot of parties. Sometimes, there are girls that are interested, and they wouldn't believe me when I told them I'd have to go back to my room to draw comic books. I think they thought I was lying or out of my mind, one of the two. So there's this weird element of like, meeting people, meeting girls on the road, but also, living a very nerdy life, like, what comic books represented to me since I was a kid. So yeah, that was a strange existence that I still kind of chuckle about, honestly.
that's one of the more interesting stories I think we've had. So how did you land that gig with Marvel? Were you a penciler for Marvel or what were you doing
Yeah,
for
I mean,
Marvel?
I was a penciler, and even as a kid, I was always very passionate about getting my hands on. any material, magazines or periodicals that sort of explain how things are created, and like in the sense of I wanted to know how comic books were created because I've said it before. When you grow up, and you start out really liking the characters, and then I started to notice the art styles, and then I started thinking about, well, there's a whole list of credits here, the people that create this one issue, and so I
Yeah.
started seeking out any comics industry related magazines when I was in junior high and high school that sort of gave stories about how this is even done. And so I started learning and found out at the time anyway that if you wanted to get your work seen, you would submit off your work or you'd go to comic book conventions. And I went to my first comic book convention at San Diego Comic Con. And the first time I went there, it was pretty beneficial because
It's a big one.
I got torn to shreds. I got torn to shreds. Went to Marvel and DC first. They let me know I wasn't ready, which I wasn't. Um, you had to eat some humble pie, but I honestly feel like that was good for me because then it let me know if I was going to try and even compete in this world at all. I had to kind of up my game so that I could stand shoulder to shoulder with the people who were getting work that were polished professionals. And so from the first time I went there and I kind of got, I sort of got my butt handed to me. I went ahead and took things to heart that I was told to work on, and I spent the next 2 or 3 years working on those, practicing. So the next time I went back to San Diego, I decided to repeat the pattern, and I went to DC and Marvel first. And DC asked me, the first thing they asked me, they go, "Who are you working for?" So that was an immediate like validation, like
That's
they thought
awesome.
my work
Yeah.
looked professional. And so I went through an entire, kind of a roster of comic companies that were both big and small. And long story short, I ended up hooking up with an artist who was doing some work from Malibu, and I had some interest from their editor, but I didn't hear back from him for a few months. And then, in fact, I always love telling the story. My roommate at the time, who's a very dear friend, he decided to play what he thought was a funny practical joke, but it was kind of cruel. He pretended to be that editor, and I
Oh
thought,
my
oh, and
gosh.
then he admitted that it was him playing a joke, and I didn't want it to wring his neck because I'm like, why would you do that? It's really mean,
Right.
but it's funny when I look at it now. But anyway, so about 3 months passed, and then I got this phone call on my voicemail saying, the editor was like, "This is Matt Mora from Mighty Marvel Comics, and I would like to talk to you about possibly working for me." So I had to go to that roommate and say, "Did you do this too? Did you leave this message on your answering machine?" He goes, "No, no, I'm not. No, I didn't do it this time." And so I was shaking, and I called him back on my phone, and that's kind of how it all began. And I think that what some people don't realize, anything that's in the entertainment industry, like it's not like you fill out an application or drop off your resume and you automatically get the gig. There's a lot of walls to sort of go through. There's gatekeepers there. So it doesn't matter if you want to get involved in movies, you want to be on TV, a band that wants to,
Right.
have a record exec listen to their album. Comics, honestly, are really no different. It really boils down to sometimes timing and the talent, but also a number of other aspects. And so, anything that I've done, even including my time in the video game industry, always required a lot of kind of going through these hoops, going through piercing the veils, these walls, to get to that level
Yeah.
where you're kind of brought in, I guess, to be seen and to be part of that world and stuff. So, but I equate it when I did get that call from Marvel. I had the chills, and I said I equated it to like an actor being told, "Oh, hey, guess what? You got a spot on a TV show, or you got a
That's
spot in a
that's so
movie."
cool.
That's how emotionally, satisfying it was.
Wow. That's pretty freaking cool. So, your process sounds very involved. You're getting feedback, and then you went back and you really just kept upping your game. Can you tell me a little bit about your process then and your process now and how that's evolved in creating characters specifically?
Well, as far as creating characters go, like when you're younger, you're so enthusiastic about the art of just drawing and creating that you sort of kind of jump right in. And there can be a number of steps that get you to like whether or not it's a finished character design, finished piece of artwork. Usually you kind of do things in layers. And as I got older, especially working in video games, I learned the art of doing iterations, and iterations meaning that like if you have, if somebody comes to you and says, "I want a character like out of World of Warcraft. I want him to be an orc, one of those big kind of ogreish looking green things with the pointed ears, and a warrior, it doesn't matter what it is, a wizard, sorcerer." You do a number of roughs to sort of kind of hone in the direction that it could go. And I do that actually now with my own characters. I kind of apply the same thing that a concept artist does, where you just don't like do one drawing of a character and say, "This is it." I think that there has to be solutions that are arrived at, and that includes like sort of getting it down on paper in front of you, or getting it on your computer and drawing on the computer, but just to kind of give an idea, well, this is close to what maybe the finished character should look like, but we're not quite there. We'll do a few more versions or iterations
Mm.
till we feel like it's kind of all being dialed in. And like I said, even with my own work, like with Black Alpha, I spent a number of years doing basically concept art, tons of character designs of spaceships, getting an idea for what the planets will look like, the environments, the world, the architecture of the cities,
Wow.
the history of alien cultures, and it's what is known as world building, and that's actually one of my funnest aspects of creating stories, is kind of being able to really fill in the blanks for the audience, and you create this entire culture, with a history and stuff like that, and I think it gives a more solid foundation if you want your audience to be invested in the stories. I mean, Star Trek and Star Wars have done plenty of that stuff years ago. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like anyone who's a fan, you can dive in and say, there's a history of Starfleet. There's all these different kind of classes of starships. You know, how long the Federation's been around. Or in Star Wars, there's these old Order of Jedi Knights that are from thousands of years before the time of Luke Skywalker, and it just gives your characters and the world and the story they reside in a certain richness, so that the story becomes much more concrete and real to your audience that's following along. So I really really enjoy doing that stuff.
Wow. So it's not just about the character design, like the way the character looks. It's a lot about the world the character lives in, how that character would interact, what the culture is, what the architecture is, how that environment affects the character, and how that character affects the environment that they're in.
Yeah, so to speak. I mean, anything that anyone's into, like if you watch a film or TV show or play a video game that people are, passionate about, I mean, they all kind of arrive at the same solutions to the same process, which is it's a multi-layered, I keep saying that, a multi-layered process and experience of making that world, whatever your narrative storytelling device is, it makes it much more concrete and real by putting all this kind of background work into stuff. And of course, I also have mentioned this a number of times, even at the con that I met you at. I talked about the art of exposition, where you'll have a character in your story. Classic would be the cantina sequence in the original Star Wars, where Han
Oh
Solo's
yeah, I
sitting there
love
telling
that.
telling yeah telling Ben Kenobi and Luke Skywalker that when Kenobi says, if it's a fast ship, and he brings up, you've never heard of the Millennium Falcon, it's a ship that made the Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs. That's a perfect example of exposition that gives history, to just that moment, and
Right.
it tends to be memorable. Or, this one is not as known, but like, when they're getting ready to do the Death Star trench run, one of the other pilots is kind of complaining that the amount of space they have to work in to launch the proton torpedo, I think he said, is around, I don't know if it's like 3 or 6 meters, and looks like,
Yeah.
oh well, hey, I used to bullseye womp rats, back with my T-16. They're not much bigger than 6 meters, and so those things as a kid even stood out to me, because then it kind of gives you like a little, you're riding on the shoulders of the character who's referencing their own personal history, and maybe history of the culture that they're part of. And I
Wow.
can say this, by the way, since we're talking about doing a marketing show, I'm fully, my full regalia of Black Alpha. I have a Black Alpha hat. That's the symbol of
Yep.
the main character. And I've got this Black Alpha T-shirt, which is a schematic of my hero ship, which is the hero ship is the Enterprise of the Millennium Falcon. So I have my own hero ship called the Aramis 7. And there's actually a line of dialogue in one of the future issues of the comic, where there's a flashback sequence, and my lead character finds this crashed spaceship. There's an AI that's aboard it, explaining, oh, well, this is a CT, and then my character says, oh, yeah, CT-7 class hypercruiser. Saw one of these in a museum once. I do that same kind of notion of, like, it creates history,
Wow.
just those simple little terms for the audience, that now you're learning a little bit about the ship and its history just by a line of dialogue that a character recites. So I've definitely taken a lot of inspiration from both Star Trek and Star Wars, and anything really for that matter, where they'll mention something, or even a phrase, like, obviously, "May the Force be with you," "Live long and prosper," phrases that the characters know. I even have my
Yeah.
own phrases in Black Alpha, same kind of thing, where the characters, certain factions of characters, will use these phrases. And like, one of the ones in my story is that the pirates, there's a pretty heavy contingent of, like, space pirates, and they have a saying that, when they're startled, they say, "What in the nine moons?" So if anyone who's lived in pirate culture,
Oh,
in my
that's
story,
funny.
that's just kind of a common phrase to, like, "What in the
Yeah.
world?" or something. Another example of, like, just sort of adding some richness and history and giving your story just as much characterization as your characters.
Okay, so this is going off script. We have sort of some questions, but how do you keep all of this organized in your head? How do you remember all of the tiny details that you've built for that backstory? That just seems incredible to me.
Well, um, sometimes I can't speak for everybody. This is kind of a self-diagnosed thing, but I do feel like in certain instances I have a bit of the autism spectrum. And so any of these terms that I come up with, they automatically kind of get locked into like this kind of memory file system I have in my brain.
Wow.
However, as more of the stories grow and the characters grow, I'll admit I've had to buy some notebooks now and start writing stuff down because, like I
Okay.
said, it gets pretty crowded in there, and then that can lead to a little bit of confusion. But I think because I've thought of these things for so many years, and it's like a repeated loop in my mind. It's the theater of my mind that's kind of replaying these images and maybe story directions or scenes that, because of the repeated motif, it sort of kind of cements memory moments for me, if that makes sense. So basically, when I come up with these and I start repeating them enough, and then like I said, I have classes of ships in my story that I only know, and I hope the people that are into spaceship stuff will start to be like me, where they'll start remembering ship classes among other things, and I've got like all the different names. I do have some like visual call outs to like the different alien species in my stories because the same thing. Like I love Star Trek and the Klingons and
Yeah.
Romulans and all that kind of stuff.
Wow.
Star Trek or Star excuse me, Star Wars isn't quite as known for that. I mean, except for a Wookiee. I mean, there's
Yeah.
there's other races like a Twi'lek, but they're not as well known as like the Romulans and the Klingons and stuff for the general. I think the general populace. But I'm saying Star Wars does that just as well either. And it's all. I
Yeah.
think, like I said, as a fan, whether or not it was through sort of like maybe subconscious discovery or I guess blatant education, I just kind of learned the passion and the entertainment, but to also go along with the construction of this stuff. Because like I said, as a kid, I'm always trying to learn new things and learn how the soup is made, so to speak, the stew. Like the recipes and
Yeah.
all this stuff. So
Well, on that note, this isn't I guess a tea's almost a soup, right? I guess when you steep it, it's
yeah.
kind of a soup. This is a very good tea. It's subtle. It's not slap you in the face. It's a very subtle
Hmm.
tea, very subtle floral. I've been drinking it, and I forgot to sort of introduce what I'm tasting here. Um, the thing with oolong that I've learned, so here's a bit of tea education, is that it's actually the after the second ish flush that you really start to get really good flavors out of it. So a flush, for anybody who's watching, is when you steep it. And what they'll do a lot of
Okay.
times is they'll steep it once, they'll dump that out, they'll steep it again, and that's the second flush. And then those flavors really start to come out. So, this is still the first flush of this, and the flavors are coming out. I think on the second flush, it's going to be even better. On here, it does say that yeah, up to three flushes. So that's pretty exciting. Just as a side note for our tea, but going back to you, Tom, and everything you're talking about, that is incredible. Keeping that vast library of knowledge in your mind, and I'm sure that probably helps when you're explaining your concept to television or movie studios or publishers. Can you tell me a bit about that process when you are talking to people who are decision makers in those entities, and what you kind of need to do to have all your ducks in a row to go and give the pitch or to talk to those types of people?
Well, I'll probably hit this in about two or three areas. So first of all, I will say that in the social media age, any of these opportunities that have happened for me, whether or not it's getting my comic published in USA Today, merchandise prototypes that we're seeing on The Big Bang Theory, even getting interest from Hollywood producers, all came about because of social media. I use social media as kind of
Wow.
my platform of networking. And I mean, anytime that there's been interest in anything, especially my characters, as far as movies and TV show, there's usually a producer. And I do network with a lot of people out of Hollywood. I have a lot of friends that are writers and directors and actors and stuff. And I keep my page drama free. That's also another thing about social media that I personally have not been a fan of, but teaches on as far as how they run their page. My page is about sharing. I'm very proud of my daughter, so I share a lot of pictures of her. Everything else is more like sharing my work, sharing my drawings, sharing my history, sharing things I grew up loving. You'll end up getting kind of a commonality with other fellow Star Trek fans or Star Wars fans and Batman, et cetera, that'll come and have a comment, or you'll have a dialogue with them. But that's why, when I really got more involved in, say, something like Facebook over a decade ago, that was my mission statement, was to utilize it to try and network as much as I can. And so all these opportunities have served me well through something like Facebook.
And is that your
And
main platform that you use, is Facebook?
I do. I have a Twitter account for Black Alpha. I'm really on there, and I have an Instagram account, which one of my partners from WTF Comics pretty much tends to run. Just because my time is pretty limited most of the time, and so I don't. I mean, there's definitely almost a quasi full-time job aspect of like trying to keep your social media relevant, and sometimes that requires man hours that I don't always have.
Yep.
So
Yep.
I'm glad that I have the help. But yeah, Facebook is still the primary one that I go to, and I think just because it's so interactive, it's so immediate. That's what I've always enjoyed about it. That you get immediate response, and maybe a bit of a litmus test in the market for how your work is seeming to kind of land with an audience. And of course, and then
Yeah.
I've used it as a tool to sort of promote, share the good news, share some of the highs and lows of this journey. So I'm saying that's kind of how most of these opportunities have come about. Now, another aspect of that is there's a bit of etiquette too with social media. Like when I'll meet some producers that I'll see will come through, like they'll have an announcement in Deadline Hollywood, and then I'll send them a friend request. And the first thing I say is I just introduce myself saying, thanks for the ad. I'm Tom Rasch. Nice to meet you. I don't, because one mistake I think certain overego people have is that they introduce themselves to someone and they're like, oh, by the way, check out my Kickstarter for my comic coming out.
Too
It's just
quick.
kind of considered bad. Yeah, bad form, and right away the person I think feels used, and it sort of obviously defeats the purpose. So I always tell people, if you're going to try and do some networking, do not be overeager, do not be pushy, just be casual and sort of let them discover you, through if the algorithms, you start showing up in the algorithms on their page. And that's how people came to me, like, or someone that I might have seen, same thing, someone I might have seen promote something on Facebook. I'll reach out to them and say, hey, I'm so-and-so, here's my history. Nice to meet you. And then if I feel like we have, if there's a dialogue that begins rolling, then I might sort of take the plunge and say, hey, by the way, but most often than not, I'll have people come to me in the industry and say, hey, what is this thing? This thing looks really cool. Um, is somebody developing it? And that's how a lot of these initial conversations went. And I still kind of utilize that. In fact, even Salem Tusk, that one came about. And he got me in touch with Bishop Stevens, an actor who used to be WCW, WWE. He'd been on shows like Walking Dead, Empire, Chicago PD, and he's an African.
Oh, wow.
Salem Tusk, by the way, is an African American kind of Indiana Jones.
Yeah.
So Neil, as he likes to be known, he connected Bishop and I. Bishop immediately liked the idea of the character, and we formed an instant partnership. So there's another example of like,
So networking is
him
so
kind of.
important in that.
Oh, incredibly important. That's why, like I said on my page, you'll never see any like controversial subjects.
Yeah. So
And
okay,
I'm
so
always kept up. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
no, yeah, keep going. It always seems like some of the biggest opportunities come from just sort of serendipitous connections with people and serendipitous networking where this person knows this person, and before you know it, you're connected with all the people you need to be connected with on a project. We've felt that. I felt that, and I think that, as you're saying, just being very authentic, probably, and not pushy with those relationships is super important.
Well, and considering that this is a marketing program, as you and I talked when we first met, I mean, there's an element that there's a language there of marketing that I think, has to be somewhat, I guess, just having a self-awareness about marketing and your vision. I think probably, somebody maybe spends time honing what that is. And for me, like I said, this hat and this T-shirt is marketing.
Yeah.
It's basically me wearing apparel because I like that stuff anyway, and it creates a conversation piece. In fact, I had Black Alpha T-shirts made about 15, 16 years ago, and a lot of my siblings, those were gifts that I gave them when I got them done. And my sister would be over in England, one of them. And I come from a large family, by the way, 5 boys and 5 girls. So I have a lot of
Oh,
brothers and
wow.
sisters.
Wow.
Excuse me, one of my sisters was in England, and she said people would want to know who the character was on the T-shirt. So that creates a conversation piece. And so I'm always trying to think of things. And what I've also stated numerous times is I take what I have seen or I've analyzed that works, and I give it my fresh coat of paint. And so when I
Mm.
watch the marketing aspects about business and marketing 101, it doesn't matter whatever the product is. You're wondering, you kind of analyze their approach. Maybe it's a visual aesthetic, graphic design aesthetic, philosophical ideas and directions on how to get people interested in what you're doing. And of course, in this day and age, everyone really loves to kind of be spoon-fed the juggernauts of pop culture, like anything that we all grew up with. I brought up Star Trek and Star Wars already several times, and then Marvel and DC superheroes, things that are based on famous books. And so when you're trying to introduce new characters in the market, you have to kind of find an edge that makes it stand out. So wearing a hat and a T-shirt of my particular comic, one of them, and I've seen other comic artists do that too with their own creator-owned work. And creator-owned, for people not in the know, is like Marvel and DC own the characters that they publish, and creator-owned artists and creators, they own them themselves. So it's like they're literally something they've developed themselves and have come up with. And so I'll give you a perfect example. When Star Wars first premiered, which it was 1977 when it premiered, but I remember following the story of it being made when I was a young child. And then Charles Lippincott, who was the marketing specialist for Star Wars, he got them a licensing deal with Marvel publishing an adaptation of the comic book for the first film. And then he was going around trying to drum up interest and word of mouth. And he went to the comic book conventions having T-shirts ready, having posters ready, and maybe some stills from the film. And then, of course, in the later years, the later decades, I've seen the film companies themselves will show up at San Diego Comic-Con, have these monster displays that show like full-size statues or mannequins, maquettes of the characters.
Yeah.
I've taken that approach in what I do, where I basically have all these action figures created of a number of my characters, and I bring posters and I bring stuff for the audience to buy. So that kind of spreads the word of mouth in the marketing, sort of giving them a taste. One of the first cons I had when I was getting the word out about Black Alpha, I did a preview edition, which wasn't the full comic. It was just, probably 4 to several pages of the story itself, the sequential part. And then behind it, I had some of my concept designs for spaceships and a little hint about, aspects of the universe. And that was a way to kind of get the word out. Like, here's a book that's coming, to kind of create buzz around it. And so, just with the general interest of always wanting to learn more about almost anything, combined with the fact I'll sit back and observe what other people are doing, and then I'll just kind of sometimes borrow their approach and apply it to what I'm doing. And it does seem to gain some traction or headway, So, it seems to work. But I guess in a weird sort of way, like for me, there's that element of like marketing is interesting to me because, anything that we partake in is the byproduct of marketing. And like I said, I don't care what the product is. I don't care if it's a can of peas. It doesn't matter. It has to take a marketing
Right.
approach to get audiences interested in, I guess, consuming your content.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so you have just tons and tons of great, we call it spilling the tea, great advice to, observing the market and figuring out what's working, figuring out what's not, really focusing on your image and perception online. What is, so a huge portion of our viewers are students. They are in high school or in college, and they're wondering, what's next? What do I do to get to where I want to be? What's some advice that you would give to any student or otherwise, maybe somebody who's not a student, they're looking to make a career change? What's some advice that you'd give to someone trying to get into your line of work?
I guess first and foremost is, we live in a very exciting time because people ask me a lot of times questions about stuff, and I always bring up Google and YouTube. I said, you can type in anything in either one of those search engines and you'll almost find the answer. Like in my case, had that stuff been around when I was younger, it probably would have made some aspects of what I was trying to do a little, maybe, more of a speedy aspect to it. Like I said, I remember seeking out magazines, that might have information. And of course, nowadays, you could look up something on Google or YouTube and you'll be like, how does a person get into doing comic books? Or, any of it, the production of comic books, like what are the storytelling, aspects 101 of like composition and breaking it down and pacing, et cetera. I would just say, utilize Google, stuff like Google and YouTube as much as you can, because like I said, there's so many answers out there at our disposal. And
Yeah.
I'm living proof that I can, if I have a question or an idea or an interest in something or I'm more curious about it, I generally will find my answers on digital platforms like that 98% of the time. And then I'll apply that to kind of whatever I feel like my next steps are. I do feel like too, though, maybe spending a little time, if you're a younger person, um, just kind of opening up the world to you and basically, helping you sort of hone vision. I think that's important. Um, allowing yourself to kind of
Vision.
develop vision through
Yeah.
whether or not it's through interesting documentaries or once again, self-education. Like I said, I like to do a lot of, and just sort of figure out from point A to point B, what do I want my path to be? Um,
Wow.
because in my case, like I said, as a child, and I knew that storytelling was kind of my thing. I still, and to this day, I mean, I still love reading comic books. I still love watching movies. I can still enjoy them as a consumer, as a fan. But always in the corner of my brain, I can also sit there and go, how was that made, and how did they come up with these solutions? Um, Solution building is maybe, I guess, what I would call it. So I would just say that utilize technology because there's so many answers at your fingertips, and then also say maybe give yourself some time to kind of step back and not put any pressure on yourself, and just allow it to kind of like organically roll out naturally, and maybe trying to figure out a direction you want to go in life.
That's some great advice. Again, spilling the tea here on Marketing Tip Tea Time. Everyone, that is all the time we have today, but I feel like we have to have Tom back. There are just too many great stories that you have to share. So we'll definitely look at having you on
Yeah, I would
again
love that.
in the future. Thank you to everyone who watches the show and everybody who makes it possible. Bike Shop Agency, our producers, Josh French, our technical producer, Phil Van Drunen, Peter Romero, our music and graphics supervisor, Alyssa and Sheridan Youngval, our set designers and graphic designers. And thank you to everyone who has ever done anything for the show, including, helping us get the tea. Thank you to Rishi. Thank you to everyone who, helps us out. We really appreciate you all. Remember to go like, share, subscribe, and also check out Tom Rasch online. Go check out his IP and all of the different things that he has online, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Go follow him, go subscribe, go share. He has some great stories, and I think you're going to love all of the character development and the stories that he's created. So be sure to go find him. And everyone, please, again, go like, share, subscribe, tell your friend about us, and if you have anybody that you think would be great on the show, go ahead and reach out to us. Or if you have any questions that you'd like answered on Marketing Tip Tea Time, or a specific tea that you'd like featured, go ahead and reach out to us, and we'll try and have it on the show as soon as possible. Thank you, everyone, and Tom, thank you once again. Until next
Yes,
time.
thank you.
Yep. Na zdrowie. Cheers. Thank you.